We recently covered the story about Chinese companies purchasing American farmland. Right now, the total amount of farmland owned by Chinese companies is not substantial on paper. However, Congressman Dan Newhouse says the trend is alarming. He shared his concerns with us and also the pushback he's been facing on the issue. Congressman Dan Newhouse, thank you so much for joining us.
Happy to be with you. Yes, thank you.
Congressman, you've been one of the leading voices when it comes to China, specifically Chinese entities purchasing U.S. agricultural land. Tell us why that is and what has you concerned.
We've been seeing an increase in interest and purchase of agricultural assets in our country, in the United States, by Chinese firms, increased by a factor of 10 over, say, the last decade. Frankly, overall, the number of acres owned, American farmland acres, is not huge. The trend is concerning. And I've been watching what's happening around the world as China looks to expand its sphere of influence and control more and more resources and pieces of infrastructure. I took a trip several years ago to Central and South America and saw firsthand some of the things that they've done down there, and have heard stories about some of the activities they're involved with in other continents like Africa, and started to look around and see, those things are happening here in the United States as well. And a lot of people aren't paying attention to the fact that China is becoming a much bigger player in the agricultural industry in the United States.
Can you tell us about that amendment that you mentioned?
Absolutely. Actually, this has been going on now for 2 appropriation seasons. It's just an effort to preclude China from purchasing agricultural assets. And so, as you can imagine, there was some pushback. We're in a period of time where many people raised a concern that this would actually target Chinese people in the United States. And that was not our intention, so we made some adjustments to that. And then other people were concerned that, why are you targeting just one country? China's the only one that's doing this. That we look at other countries that are not allies, such as Russia, North Korea, Iran. They're not engaged nearly to the extent, and can't. In the cases of several of those countries, don't have the financial wherewithal to do what China is doing. But China is very engaged.
And I mean, it's a whole different discussion to talk about how China uses disinformation campaigns to manipulate the conversation by, they could be the ones behind that narrative saying that it targets Chinese people.
Well, you probably know a little bit more about that than I do. But you're absolutely right. I think that some of the resistance and some of the pushback that we felt over the last year could very well have originated from them, because they have a lot on the line, a lot invested in our country, and they want to protect that. And the amendment passed unanimously a year ago through the Appropriations Committee. I was very happy about that. But then through the bringing the bill to the Rules Committee and eventually to the floor, it went through a couple of more iterations. It added those other countries, put in some language so that it wouldn't be seen as just targeting Chinese individuals. And so we tried to be more specific about the intention. And then by the time it got through the conference process between the Senate and the House, essentially it was narrowed down to just asking the Department of Agriculture for a report on how much China has purchased over the last several years. So, and frankly, I'm not even sure we've gotten that report yet from the USDA. So the effort was redoubled to do this again with another attempt in language at the appropriations level in the committee, and then also standalone legislation so that we could address this head on.
So we were having a chat earlier about China owning or having 50% of the world's grain supply. There's talk of food shortages. We're seeing the inflation through various things that we purchase in the supermarket. Can you tell us, are there regulatory barriers that can be broken down to help relieve some of this pain for farmers?
One thing that many people have heard of is the Waters of the United States regulations. The Waters of the United States that's become known as WOTUS, which is, in my estimation, truly the most egregious regulatory overreach by the federal government ever. This will dictate how every farmer in the country uses their land. They have to get a permit through the federal government, and this isn't just wild talk to potentially change crops, to plow in the spring, depending on what water bodies are in the neighboring area or on their land that would impact what's seen as water pollution. States are already doing a lot of this kind of stuff. We had regulations that were put in place under the last administration. This administration wants to go back to the Obama era, which was very, very egregious as far as the restrictions that it put on farmers and that dictated to them how they actually ran their farms. So we want to put a hold on that. There's other things that are happening in the Environmental Protection Agency.
Congressman Dan Newhouse, thank you.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is reportedly reviving plans to visit Taiwan. That's after canceling a trip in April. But it comes amid a particularly sensitive time and as Beijing lashes out at the U.S.
Nancy Pelosi is reportedly packing her bags for Taiwan. That's according to a Tuesday Financial Times report that cites 6 people familiar with the trip they say is slated for August. And if that actually happens, the House Speaker will be the highest-ranking American lawmaker to visit the island in decades.
The demonstration of support for Taiwan against China's bullying, that's the critical issue.
The visit comes at a delicate timing, as the Chinese military, which has long been suspected of planning an invasion to the democratically ruled island, is commemorating its founding anniversary in August. It also comes as Xi Jinping is seeking to extend his reign in the Communist Party's Congress later this year. And Beijing is already lashing out. Its foreign ministry warned on Tuesday that Beijing's relations with Washington will be severely damaged if Pelosi visits Taiwan to show support. But Seth Cropsey, president of the Yorktown Institute, tells NTD that he doesn't think the regime would actually do anything drastic that would lead to escalation.
Xi Jinping and the Communist Party are distinguished for several things. Bullying is one of them, and making a lot of fuss is another.
The Financial Times also noted that some in the White House had expressed concerns about the trip. But Joseph Bosco with the Global Taiwan Institute tells us that he hopes Biden will make clear the United States' commitment to defend Taiwan.
There are people who are nervous about doing anything that makes Beijing upset, but it's time we got over that and started just doing things that make sense from a U.S. policy standpoint.
Meanwhile, Biden and Xi are slated to hold an online meeting in the coming weeks in which Taiwan could be a topic of discussion.
The Biden administration is reinterpreting federal law so that certain illegal immigrants can be shielded from deportation and employed legally. Department of Homeland Security is giving temporary protected status, or TPS, to 15 countries. Some of those countries include Afghanistan, El Salvador, Somalia, Ukraine, and Venezuela. Immigrants protected by TPS used to have to stay in the country unless they got approval to travel. But now people with TPS who travel and return will be considered legal entrants to the U.S. Jessica Vaughn, a policy studies director at the Center for Immigration Studies, told the Epoch Times that basically launders the fact that they came here illegally, and that will put them on the path to a green card. Emilio Gonzalez, who directed the USCIS during the George Bush administration, said it is really a left-handed way of legalizing people. Dr. Anthony Fauci announced that he will be stepping down from the White House chief medical advisor role by the end of President Biden's current term. However, there are still some questions as to whether or not that will happen. What are some takeaways from the prospect of Fauci's retirement? Rick Mehta is a former FDA official and current law professor at Georgetown University. and he joins us to discuss. Rick Mehta, thank you so much for joining us on the Capitol Report.
My pleasure.
Rick, news has broke yesterday that Dr. Fauci will be leaving his post by the end of President Biden's term, which is roughly 2025, assuming he goes to the full term. What is your reaction to that?
Well, listen, Dr. Fauci has been in office for over 50 years. He's been the director of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases since 1984. There's two really proud moments in every bureaucrat's life. When they first get their government job and their last day of their government job. And the truth is, I think Dr. Fauci has overextended his stay in his bureaucratic position. I think he sees the writing on the wall. Republicans are going to take control of the House and the Senate, and he's going to come under more strict scrutiny and congressional hearings about the gain of function of the virus. And I think he's not looking interested anymore to be in the hot seat.
Rick, a lot has happened since the early stages of the pandemic when we faced masking and lockdowns. We've had the vaccine rolled out. What are some of the most obvious things that have changed with the science and the data from the earlier time?
Well, listen, Dr. Fauci has continued to misdirect the American public. When it first started, we were reassured that we would reach herd immunity and that everyone should get vaccinated. Now they're forcing vaccinations upon the American public, telling them to get booster upon booster. And then we're seeing a spike in COVID cases among those that are currently vaccinated. We saw a complete disrespect for our constitutional rights during the entire COVID pandemic. We saw lockdowns, mandatory lockdowns, and mandatory masking that were continued to be slapped down by the federal court systems. And so, public health has been the musings and whims of a few bureaucrats without respect to constitutional rights, and that's continuing to change. In fact, Dr. Fauci himself admitted just the other day that COVID is here to stay. And he's encouraging that this is going to be like the flu, where everyone will be vaccinated year upon year. And so, I think the American public has lost a lot of confidence in our response to public health. I think the American public is ready to move on with new public health acumen and leadership, but one that also respects constitutional rights. I think that's changed significantly.
Rick, to your point, we're starting to see places like Los Angeles now starting to mandate masking up indoors yet again. This has also been now supported by one of President Biden's COVID experts. Why do you think there is a certain refusal to acknowledge the science, at least on the masks?
Well, I think a lot has to do with the misinformation that's been put out there. What are the studies that the Fauci administration, Fauci's team has relied on, along with the CDC, to say that masking is going to reduce or curtail the spread of the virus? And I think it's that kind of lack of scientific basis in terms of their decision making, because at the same time, we're continuing to see spikes in COVID without it being tailored based on an evidence-based approach.
Now, trust has been eroded to a certain extent. How do you think it can be restored? And is there a fear that if there is a real serious situation, another global pandemic or epidemic in the future, that people will be less likely to react now?
We need answers. The American public is built off of transparency, and we saw with the origins of the virus, we never got answers on gain of function research. We never got answers on whether or not the strain was leaked from the Wuhan laboratories. But the first step is in rebuilding American trust is to create transparency around what happened, what were the origins, who was responsible, and what's the accountability. That's step one. Step two, it's got to be an evidence-based response. If you tell the American public that they have to mask up or they have to get vaccinated, then make sure it's supported by continuing evidence to the American public versus a top-down, I know best, do what I tell you, and you will be fine. That kind of approach hasn't been working with the majority of the American public, especially in those that are in Republican states. So, once we have some more clarity from the scientific perspective, I think that we will, again, restore American public and American trust.
Rick Mehta, appreciate your insights.
Thank you. 2
Chinese naturalized U.S. citizens were arrested for money laundering and fraud. According to the Justice Department complaint, more than 150 investors were cheated out of millions of dollars on a fake project. Allegedly, many of the investors were foreign nationals who were promised green cards. Sherry Xue Li and Lianbo Wang are accused of defrauding investors out of more than $27 million. The pair allegedly convinced investors by saying that they had the support of prominent politicians. For example, the Patch reported that federal prosecutors said Li took a photo in June of 2017 with then-President Trump at a fundraiser, then used it to solicit investments for a fake project. Li donated over $270,000 to the Trump Victory Committee in 2017, and on that same day, Wang donated $330,000. This is raising concerns over China's efforts to influence and infiltrate influential political spheres within the United States. We'll be following this story and will update you as details emerge.